Hey everyone, and welcome to the Entry Level Left. I'm Matt,
I'm Jared.
I'm Nathan.
and tonight we're going to be talking about white supremacy, which has sort of kind of become a buzzword in the media and a lot of the news that we see and hear, especially online. But we really want to get into the thick of it and dissect what this is and what it comes from. So, my first question that I'd pose to the group is, what exactly is white supremacy?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, white supremacy is a structural kind of embedded hierarchy, typically within Western societies, that places like white people, white cultural narratives, sort of at the height of society.
And like whiteness, just
Yeah,
whiteness.
just whiteness in general, at like as sort of this like superior echelon of society, and with that too, kind of establishes a set of morals and social customs and practices that seek to continue that narrative long term in society and at the expense of non-white people in that same society. And so we're talking white supremacy as being primarily within the Western states, but two, globally speaking, it's been enacted upon what we commonly refer to as the Southern nations, Southern Hemisphere
The global
nations, the
south.
global South,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, the global south that we talked about in previous episodes. So global south, just if you're tuning in for the first time, would be like Latin America, Africa, and global north could be like Canada, the US, northern and western Europe. Things like that would be like the regional distinctions between those two concepts. And like Jared said, it's very much this racist belief that white people are superior to people of other races, therefore they should be dominant over them. And that, like Jared said, sort of manifests culturally in the values that it sort of reproduces in society and so on.
There's a very tangible effect as well. The Atlantic reported that in 2018, almost all homegrown terrorists were right wingers. And even a little bit more abstract than that is the rhetoric. It'd be hard to find people who would disagree that ever since Trump started at least running, there's resurgence in right wing rhetoric. And a lot of it is around white supremacy. I mean, like remember Steve King, I think, came out and
Yeah.
said, well,
Yeah.
what's so bad with being a white nationalist? You know what I
Right.
mean? So you hear these types of conversations happening.
Yeah.
You have to ask, when do you put a stop to that?
And even Trump himself was like, I'm a nationalist. What's wrong with
Right.
being a
And I
nationalist?
think that's the thing is this it's ultimately it's an appeal that, like what you were just saying, like the Trump movement, the rise of right-wing violence, like there's a large appeal to white supremacy and all of that from people who feel that white dominance over society is structurally dissipating because we're becoming more diverse and we're being more, rhetorically inclusive. So there's a big appeal there, yeah, to
Or
that.
they feel a need to defend so-called white culture.
Right.
Build the wall. Why?
Yeah.
What is the
Right.
deeper purpose of building the wall? Why are you so focused on people in Mexico but not people in Scandinavia
Or
who,
Canada,
who
yeah.
overstay visas?
Right.
what is the difference between those two
Right,
immigrants?
and to-
it should be pretty obvious what it is.
Yeah, and two, like, what is the purpose of the wall? To keep people out who have been branded as, like, rapists
Criminals.
and
Yeah.
criminals, which is it goes back as far as you really can find in Western society of these tropes of non-white people being like barbarians, basically. Like they'll rape and pillage and murder your precious white society if they're let through the gates.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that I think is important to note, it can be very latent. It can be almost very subconscious in society too. It's like maybe some of these like make America great again people don't necessarily think that white people are like dominant or supreme over other races, but they just think that these people are taking their jobs, for example, or they're making their economic situation worse, for example. And it's like maybe they don't think and believe in like racist ideas, like more like extreme right wing people do. But the fact that they don't care enough about getting to the structural root of the problem, which is like we've been talking about in our previous episodes on imperialism, when we try to explain a little bit about the history of why these things have been cemented into Western society in an economic way. And then when we talk about uneven development later on in our following episode, we kind of explain the dynamic and how capital accumulation intersects with these issues and compounds them over a period of decades and centuries almost. So with that, what are some examples of white supremacist movements, either in the US or even on a global stage?
So I think when you first say that, when you say like what are white supremacist movements, your head kind of always first goes to like neo-Nazi skinheads or like KKKs. Maybe if you're looking historically into like Confederates and stuff like that, which we're definitely white supremacists. Don't get it twisted. Right?
Don't get it twisted.
We're not going to get into a debunk right now, but it was definitely a white supremacist movement. But and even like Jim Crow era governments,
Yes.
you know, or like apartheid in South Africa.
Right.
These are all things that are white supremacist movements in one way or another. But I think what's important is that you look at some of the more recent examples that are, like you said earlier, a little bit more latent. Not that the historical ones aren't bad, because you could run on a racist platform all the way up until the 60s, you know, and still be popular, even beyond that in the US. But more recent examples, they get a lot fuzzier. So like white identitarian groups, that's like the word you'll hear a lot, or sometimes like white separatist groups.
Right.
Like, for example, Identity Europa, or you might hear this name a lot, Richard Spencer. He runs the National Policy Institute. And they're kind of like these like dressed up versions of white supremacy.
Right.
They've kind of changed the rhetoric. They've sort of rebranded.
And the imagery and all that, yeah.
The only times you can really see their white supremacist comes out is when you kind of catch them off guard. Like at this point in the world, everything is online, you know?
Yeah.
And these guys will go to the Unite the Right rally and they'll live stream it themselves, like talking to David Duke or chanting things like blood and soil or whatever.
Right, Jews will not replace us, that stuff, yeah.
They'll turn around and be like, no, I disavow that. I don't support the KKK or I don't this or whatever. But they'll have like Nazi imagery, but usually not a swastika, something a little bit more subdued, you know, 1488 or whatever. And they'll use that type of imagery to sort of hide, but at the same time, dog whistle to those who, you know, might be in the know about what they're about.
Right. It's like well-dressed Nazism. That's they want to get away from like what is perceived as like open, like barbaric white nationalism, and they want to dress it up and make it look nicer.
That's exactly what it is. It's kind of this political marketing where they take the MAGA culture, right? And they dress it up to sort of appeal to these like edgy online communities like Reddit, like r/the Donald or whatever it is.
4chan too.
Yeah, 4chan, exactly. And these online communities that are just havens for these like right-wing, you know, shitbags that talk about the Great Replacement and all these different pseudoscientific ideas about racism and phrenology and whatever they can come out to sort of justify why white people should be dominant over others in society. But when you get right down to it, it's just dressing up like these white identitarian movements and these, you know, alt-right movements, even the Proud Boys to some extent, are really just kind of dressing up this white supremacist, like, love of Western culture. And it's funny because, like, the Proud Boys will even go so far as to allow, you know, Asians and black people into their ranks. But in a sense, it's still maintaining this hierarchy of like white dominance because if you really get right down to it, like what does a black person or a Asian person really look at when they're talking about those things? Like these are very like white European values that they're espousing, and they've been somehow brainwashed into thinking are in any way in their interest.
Yeah, the Proud Boys call themselves specifically Western chauvinist. Yeah. Which is like, what countries are you talking about? Who's the Western countries? You know who they're talking about. They're talking about white countries.
Right,
you know?
yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think, you know, even too, you know, when we talk about white supremacist movements, like, you know, we think of like, you were kind of alluding to, like, one of the first ones that jumps to your mind is like, you know, the Klan and stuff like that and how that's changed over time, although they obviously still are. But even if you think of the Klan as a white supremacist movement, I mean, the Klan is an organization that was largely a reaction to Black Reconstruction in America post-Civil War, right? And you're talking about a group that organized and terrorized Black communities because of the fact that post-Reconstruction, you know, you had more Black elected officials. Post-Civil War, you had Black representation, more capital investment. There was supposed to be reparations, aka 40 acres and a mule, but the Klan organized, they crushed all of that, and it led to the Jim Crow era, you know? So that in itself is a movement that was in reaction to what they viewed as a more inclusive diversification of, society at that time, post-Civil War. Many of those sort of sentiments are kind of, again, what we're seeing now in this rise of alt-right violence and the Donald Trump presidency and the formation of these movements. There are cross parallels to the emergence of these things and why they emerge, which is largely a reaction to what they seem to see as more diversification. I don't think that it is a coincidence that Trump's popularity and his ultimate presidency followed the Obama administration, right? We often teach white supremacy and racism, I think, very wrong, not only in the West as a whole, but especially in the United States. Because like when we think of white supremacists, like when you say that and you think of like people like Richard Spencer, right, who are rebranding the movement, a lot of that has to do, I think, with the reason that when we teach racism and white supremacy in the US, we teach it as like racist people like view themselves as racist and want to be bad people. You know what I mean? When in reality, it's like they're not viewing what they're doing as being nefarious. Like they feel threatened and attacked. And I think when you talk about what motivates white supremacy, I think there's a material element there. I think people feel like, at least now, for instance, even though we know structurally that capitalism has been, at the advent of neoliberalism, been completely disenfranchising working class people across this country.
Yeah, even in white communities.
Right, even in white communities. And they're instead, being fed information that the reason they're poor and the reason they're impoverished and the reason, pay is so low is because of undocumented labor, China taking over the global community, or whatever, which whether or not there's elements of truth there, it's the fact that it's Western corporations that are doing this out of profit interest. It's not, Chinese people, for instance.
Even if it were, it wouldn't be their identity. It would be the influence that they're trying to gain through monetary and market. Yeah.
Right. And I just think there's a lot of fear that motivates it in like the average person, average layman who may be coddled into this white supremacist shit. But I think what motivates it at a more broader structural level at the top echelons are a lot of profit motive. They can use white supremacy as a means to divvy up the working class, laborers amongst one another based on color lines.
Yeah, and if you think about like some of these organizations like Stormfront, or even to a lesser extent like Breitbart or PragerU, they're sort of an extensive network of media that really tries to almost like whitewash like Nazism and all types of things that maybe they don't push it as hard as some of these other groups, but they don't do anything to speak out against it, or they're more concerned with getting people to confuse like far left with far right and horseshoe theory, where people start to believe that the extremism on both sides has the same motivation, when in reality their motivations couldn't be further apart in terms of the political spectrum. But there's an extensive network of these media outlets, right? And even, Alex Jones to some extent is implicated in this just web of disinformation that we're seeing. Milo Yiannopoulos, the gun girl,
Right.
I forget her name.
The girl who shit her pants.
The girl who shit her pants. But these people are, whether conscious or not, actively engaged in this web of media outlets that really their goal for the ruling class is to just market these ideas to people, because these ideas are profitable.
Mm-hmm.
These ideas of white supremacy and, different paleo-conservative values and things like that, and this idea of like the great replacement of white people, these things, they really tug at the heartstrings of people that are economically disaffected in poor communities. So people will naturally gravitate to these things if they think that they're a reliable or accurate representation of why that they're being fucked over in life.
Right.
Yeah, we all know the guy, usually they're like in our family or something like that, who sees somebody, going to get welfare, or they're, using food stamps at the grocery store, and that's the only thing they want to talk about for half an hour is how all these people are coming in and using up all the welfare and costing everybody their hard-earned money and whatnot, while completely ignoring the fact that we're spending much, much more on things like the military or any kind of
Just war in
yeah,
general.
just mostly war. Yeah, let's get real.
Right.
To go back to kind of what Jared had said, it reminds me of the episode we did on fascism because they're using the real indignation of these people and they're focusing it on their political goals, their
Right.
political agenda. So yes, there is real reason for these people to be angry. They don't know what it is, but the right wing is there to hold their hand and tell them, well, it's the immigrants, or hey, it's the Chinese, or whoever.
Well,
Yeah.
I think too, white supremacist movements and ideologies, when they're organized, are also particularly effective because they target people that, like, let's say white working class people, for instance, interact with on a daily basis, right? Like a white person is going to go into, like, if you use the example you were talking about, like, someone's racist uncle always wants to talk about or whatever. White working class people go to grocery stores, normal grocery stores. They are going to interact with people who require, let's say, food
Yeah.
stamps to buy groceries. What they're not interacting with on a daily basis are the people, like you were saying, planning the military budget, or
Yeah, exactly.
or they're not on Wall Street seeing all the absolute just shady ass dealings that are going on that are truly robbing Americans.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to just be like, oh, that person you saw at the grocery store the other day, they're the reason why, you can't put food on the table because, big government's taking your hard-earned money and
Giving
cashing it
them,
over
yeah.
to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like I think it's a Steinbeck quote, but I'm kind of paraphrase it. But a lot of these people, they think as if they're temporarily embarrassed millionaires,
Right.
as we say. They don't look at themselves in the way like a leftist might in a structural critique, being a working class person and a ruling class person. They don't look at society in that way. They're taught this American dream bullshit and a lot of this American exceptionalist rhetoric that we get.
And just
Sort of,
neoliberalism
yeah,
in general.
sort of broadcasted through the project of neoliberalism and the military-industrial complex. These things are broadcasted to us and make us believe this entrepreneurial culture that everybody can just be an entrepreneur and everybody can be a small business owner. But if that were the case, then like
or just wealthy.
yeah, or just wealthy. Like the economy like wouldn't support that. Like there always has to be someone that is willing to work for less and allow a capitalist to exploit their labor for the capitalist to get
Right.
profit.
Yeah, and I think too, it's just hard. Like, it's much harder to think of these things structurally, like in the United States, because again, I think one thing that the U.S. has done that benefits sort of those who are in power and run the show, greatly is the idea that you're only a racist if you're saying the N-word and standing in front of a swastika or, something like that. When in reality, it goes much, much deeper than that.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that just has to be kind of fleshed out and analyzed pretty in depth. It's much easier to just tell someone this is the reason you have a problem, in your life or what have you. It's because of this person over here, as opposed to it's this much broader interconnected series of forces at play. For instance, my dad works in construction, has worked in
Right.
construction his whole life. I mean, he works with a lot of people who will say stuff like, oh, well, it's impossible for an American to make a decent living in this job, anymore because they can just hire a undocumented person to do what used to be 25 an hour job. They'll hire them for an 11 an hour. Like, they blame the undocumented laborer instead of the person who is paying them under the table with the intent to totally get rid of any form of unionization, and workers' protection and high wages. They can be like, oh, yeah, no, I'm not paying you $25 an hour when this undocumented person could do it for 11. And instead of saying, like, why is this person not paying all workers, regardless of undocumented or not, a living wage? They don't look at it like that. They blame the undocumented laborer who's just trying to survive.
Yeah, exactly. But what it really is like, and to be super clear about it, it's like, it's capitalism that allows that. Like,
Right.
you should be angry at capitalism and your boss,
Right.
just giving way to that unfettered, capitalism. That's why you're getting screwed over and you're not
Right.
able to support yourself anymore because the markets are why.
I think since the inception of large-scale white supremacist efforts, there's always been a profit motive involved. I'm not saying capitalism didn't birth white supremacy, although it certainly takes advantage of it and
Yeah,
was largely constructed under white supremacist values. But overall, from its inception, it's largely been a project to have the continued material uplifting and advent and dominance
right.
of white people in society X, Y, or Z.
Exactly. And I think that's, I mean, pretty much it. But it goes back, like we said, to the history of imperialism
Colonialism,
and
yeah, all that. Yeah.
colonialism, uneven development has formatted the society that we live in today. And even though, like, conservatives and other people want to say that you can't be racist because the civil rights era happened, I mean, it's just not true because these things have been cemented into our society on a structural level.
All right. So, with that, in discussing white supremacy, many people often, you were kind of touching on this, Matt, just a second ago. Many people often refer to it as something that was, prevalent or dominant in society in the past, and it like no longer has wide standing influence on American society, or it kind of exists in like the fringes of, rural America or what have you. But what really should be the left's response to this claim? I mean, is that a true claim?
I mean, obviously, in the past episodes that we've done, we make it pretty clear that the left stance should be anti-imperial and anti-colonial. But these things, colonialism and imperialism, they've created an environment that have solidified, this white supremacy in society, like this white dominated society. I mean, there's really no way around it. These things still play into factors of economic inequality in society today. I mean, you were talking about the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, and I mean, that's a big thing. Like when that was going on and you had compromises with the KKK to get the Jim Crow era, these are things like that make it so clear. I mean, this was less than 100 years ago.
Right.
Even as far back as to like the total extermination of indigenous Americans. I mean, it's always been a white supremacist country, and that's why I think it's comical when we have these people like Alyssa Milano going, this is not this is not my country. I don't recognize my country.
Right.
And it's like, are you kidding me? Like this has always been your country. Like
Right.
maybe you haven't been aware of it, but like America has never been great.
Well, and that's the thing is like with those kind of like posh liberal types like Alyssa Milano is that they've always not only believed in, but in many instances, propagated this like American lie. And Trump's kind of, as I was talking about with you earlier, Matt, like just kind of taking the rail off the tracks, the emperor's wearing no clothes. There's no hiding what America has always been now. And unfortunately for liberals, it's a painful thing for them to address because it's kind of pulled them out of fairyland that they've been in for however long, thinking that, oh, we just are a country that we have differences of views on, Republican and Democrat side, but as a whole, we're this unified nation where anyone can achieve their dreams and all this
Yeah.
other stuff. When in fact, for a great portion of American society, that's just fundamentally not the case, and it never has been. I mean, we were talking civil rights movement earlier, and to kind of go to this question, when many people say, oh, well, the civil rights movement already happened. MLK, this, that, and the other. We have a whole holiday. We had a black president, blah, blah, blah. People have to understand that, like, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and even after the passage of the civil rights movement, or the Civil Rights Act, sorry, it's not like racism disappeared
Yeah.
and people stopped, like, the entire civil rights movement was just like, oh, yay, we've achieved what we needed, and that's it, and we all just are going to, like, walk hand in hand into the sunshine. Like, there was the Black Panthers, the Rainbow Coalition, like, all these groups that still came out and were like, this society is still incredibly fucking racist, and also, it's no coincidence that capitalism, the driving economic force behind the United States currently, is largely responsible for this exacerbated racist society for which we live in, and that's why it resonated with people. Hence, why they were all assassinated.
Yeah,
But
and I mean, think about it like this: like, just because something is legal doesn't mean that people are going to comply with it or find it moral or ethical. And even like an example like prohibition utterly failed in America. Like,
right.
I mean, it's easier to drink alcohol than it is to like access a lot of other drugs.
Mhm.
But alcohol is like incredibly dangerous. Like
Mhm.
it's terrible for people, but it's a testament to how law has nothing really to do with ethics or morality, especially in context of America. But exactly, like this climate of all of these previous historical phenomena like imperialism, colonialism, they don't just go away because now slavery is abolished or
Right.
now because we have to technically by law treat everybody as, equal or
Mhm.
not discriminate against
Which
them.
they've been trying to revoke since that past.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get into it later, but all of these conservative politicians, everything they're trying to do is like roll back protections for certain groups and roll back social welfare programs, roll back everything that, allowed people to have a more equal shot in
Yeah.
life.
Well, not only that, an equal shot in a society that developed under extraordinarily white supremacist, unequal conditions.
People like to always say, like, well, no, why are we talking about reparations? Slavery was 150 years ago or whatever, but it was still another 100 years beyond that until they had really equal rights,
Right.
until you couldn't legally discriminate. It was until 1964
Exactly.
to where you could actually not discriminate against people for being of a different race. So to just kind of hand wipe that away, to be like, well, no, slavery's 150 years ago, everything's fine now.
Mhm.
But that's just completely asinine. And then even assuming, let's say we fixed it all in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, right? That's still not that long ago. Like, think about when your parents were born. Think about when their parents were born. Don't you think that your grandparents kind of have an important impact on your life?
Right.
Don't you think that even if you're not close with them, don't you think that they had a pretty big component?
Yeah,
They were,
effect.
or they were a pretty big component into how your parents were raised and eventually into how you were raised as
Right.
well. We've had the same queen since Jim Crow.
Right.
The queen hasn't even changed.
Right.
Like, that's how long some of
In
these
the
people.
UK, yeah.
in the UK. In the UK, the queen's the same person. So some of these people haven't even changed jobs
Right.
since Jim
Yeah.
Crow.
Right.
That just blows me away to think that, they're just going to 180 and be completely not racist now.
Yeah, and I think that, this idea too of like people, we kind of associate with, like you were just kind of alluding to, is like, these people who are like, oh, white supremacy is like in the past. Like slavery's not a thing anymore, like black people and white people can drink at the same water fountain. It's just a thing of the past, blah, blah. I think we usually associate that sort of narrative and largely for the majority, rightly so, with kind of, right-wing Republican type folks. But I think there's like a subtle element of that too that's also in a lot of liberal narratives. And you see it a lot of times with these like liberals on Twitter will be like, they'll retweet Donald Trump and be like, what would the founding fathers think of our great democracy? And I'm like, first of all, the United States didn't technically on paper even become a democracy until, as you just said, 1964, when all citizens were guaranteed the right to vote.
Exactly.
So that's number one, like
Yeah.
where you see that subtle, just quite honestly, it's often like white ignorance.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, we've been a
creeping through.
democracy for less than 100 years.
Right. And then on top of that, what would the founding fathers think? I mean, the founding fathers would probably be, maybe more articulate, but more fucking reactionary.
Well, one of the founding fathers had like a black slave mistress that
Right.
he impregnated multiple times
Right.
and treated her like complete garbage.
Right.
Like, these people were white supremacists.
But like, I don't want to like focus too hard on like that particular caricature I just lined up. But like, it just kind of shows how even on like the more liberal side, like there is an element of this that I think permeates through their more subtle language.
It leads us back to an earlier question. What motivates white supremacy? It's been embedded structurally in academia and philosophy since
Right.
the Enlightenment era. Race realism, which we may talk about a little bit later, but this concept that different people of different races are fundamentally inferior to white people based on genes or like the morphology of their skeleton, or some people believe that like black people have an extra bone or extra like
Right.
muscle in their leg or something, absolutely bullshit like that.
Right.
And it's like these institutionalized ideas have been perpetuated throughout society, throughout academia, which was largely controlled by the ruling class, by bourgeois elements and more liberal elements of society. So, it just makes perfect sense that these elements permeate both, right-wing and more liberal elements of society.
Absolutely.
And I think there's like a demonstrable element that we never address either, we'll see places like Starbucks will give like a diversity training, and we like all like kind of do our little golf
Yeah,
claps, and
clap.
we're
Right,
like,
right.
oh yes, very good, very good. I'm glad everybody's all caught up on this now.
Racism fixed.
Yeah,
Right.
it's done, right? But they do these studies and they repeat them. I think they started mostly in like the 60s, but they do these studies where they show that just having like a black name can put you at a severe disadvantage
yeah.
for getting callbacks
For getting called
on your
back
resume.
yeah.
And they do this, and people are like, well, that's just one step. No, they've repeated this so many times, and they do it like every year a fucking grad student gets in and does that same exact study.
Right.
And they get better. Some are better, some are worse, but it still is easier to get a job or a callback rather with a white name than a black name.
Right.
They've done the same thing with cars. They've had two people go in with the same backstory. One's white, one's black. The white guy gets a better price. Black guy doesn't.
Right.
The same thing with women too.
Yeah.
And black women are, what do you know, intersectionality.
Right,
They
right.
get the worst prices on cars. So you can
That's
take
it. That's
all
the
these,
one thing they get
yeah,
worse right
that's it. But that's just an example, of course,
Right,
of
yeah,
just
yeah.
the one of many things that you can just kind of do a really clean experiment on and show that these people are still disadvantaged,
Right.
no matter how much lip service we pay.
Well, I think that's a phenomenal point. I think it's a good transition to our next question, which is how does white supremacy still actively affect non-white people in American society?
I think we talked a lot about it already, but the thing is like we talked about in a previous episode, we'll reiterate throughout. Really what we're trying to create here is this ongoing discussion where we link these very enormous topics together to give people an understanding of like leftist ideology and how it makes sense and the rationale for it. But more than that, we want to relate it back to this Marxist idea of historical and dialectical materialism, where all of these things are sort of playing out, these phenomena, colonialism, imperialism, they are formatting and making these structures in our society embedded. And the way that we analyze these things through those lenses as Marxists, we have to look at the structural problems and where they come from. These things, as we've been talking about, they don't go away just because they're made illegal, right?
Right.
Just because it's illegal to be discriminating against people doesn't mean that companies and private institutions will use their power and influence and their media clout to just go and completely skirt around things. Like they evade taxes, they evade things like affirmative action, which we'll maybe talk about later. But a private institution will do whatever it can because private institutions, to be quite blunt about it, like control our society.
Right. And I think to that point, Matt, what you were just saying is exactly. You can have corporations who are doing these nefarious things. They're avoiding taxes. They're causing a substantial detriment by having funds that could otherwise benefit immensely larger social infrastructure in our current society. They evade taxes. That money obviously doesn't benefit the society that pretty much gave them all of their wealth to begin with. And at the same time, they take that money and they invest it in politicians who, once elected, tell you that the reason you're broke and the reason there's no social infrastructure and all of that is because of undocumented immigrants on welfare, black women on welfare, whatever that. I mean,
Yeah.
pick your racist trope. That's how it sort of reproduces. And I think that's exactly where the left needs to be looking at these things, talking about these things, educating people on these things to show that there is a broader system at play here that uses these appeals to white supremacy to continue to reap profits. And that was the case in the development of society to where it's at today.
Yeah.
And they're certainly not going away just because of a law or some nice appeals from Starbucks to diversify their frappuccinos or whatever. But anyway, just one thing I also want to touch on that you were kind of mentioning with how, like, you know, it's not just a law or what have you that makes these sort of things go away. Even if you use the example today of like, it's almost entirely Republican driven, but the attempt to inhibit largely people of color from being able to vote.
Yeah, voter suppression.
The voter
Just-
suppression. I mean, I just really, maybe we can include this in the show notes or something, but it's like, you know, that guy Dan Crenshaw or whatever with the eye patch, he represents the city of Houston. Look at his district encompasses the city of Houston, or it's supposed to. That's where their representation is, I guess. Look at how gerrymandered that. I mean, it literally, his district, even though it's supposed to represent like the greater Houston area, literally carves out the entire urban core Why? Who would they be wanting to keep out of that,
He wants
particular
the
election?
white suburban voters and
Right,
to kick out the black and people of color in the
Right.
city.
If you squint at it, it's kind of shaped like an eye patch.
Right. Yeah, actually.
Yeah, it kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln when you squint at it.
But I mean, it's just a perfect example again of how just because we have laws in place that are in place to allow people to express their right to vote and all that stuff, there are other things that can be done to still subvert that. And maybe we'll include the clip here or something, but I would just defer to Lee Atwater, former Republican strategist, who said, all you got to do is just, instead of saying the N-word, you say states' rights or whatever the case may be. You just change, you dress up the language, just like Richard Spencer's trying to dress up Nazism or whatever. A similar optic game can be played with legislation, etc.
Like we said before, it's just a way to market these same ideas that have been around forever to disaffected people in a different way, in a edgy way online with the 4chan trolls and the, R the Donald, whatever your poison is. I mean, they're just trying to redress these old ideas. But really what it amounts to is like people that say racism doesn't exist or white privilege doesn't exist, which we'll get into a little bit later. These are people that think of the Civil Rights Act as like their black friend, right? I can't possibly be racist because we have the Civil Rights Act. So if we really wanted to say that we are not racist, we would be putting more effort to things like redistribution of wealth, reparations. These are things that structurally will eliminate over time the divide that has been created in society based on uneven development, the urban capital accumulation, and imperialism and colonialism, as we've talked about before. I mean, that's really the legacy of this inequality, and you can't get away from it by just being nice about it. You can't just remove structural inequality by being more inclusive or doing diversity trainings. Like, that's why right-wingers think diversity is bad, because they see it as just this liberal identity politic. But really, if we got serious about it and said, okay, well, here's how much these communities lost, and we can do this for a lot of things. Like, if you remember after World War II, the Japanese internment camps, I mean, we made figures of how much these Japanese communities actually lost in terms of wealth by being put under these policies. And we can do that, into some sense for these communities that have been disinvested from, and these communities of people of color that could use reparations to make society more just for them. I mean, we can do this. If we had the political will to do it, we could make these changes and reverse these structural disadvantages. That's the difference, I would say, in our next question, which we'll talk about more, which would be the difference between, my personal conception of what these problems are versus like a liberal conception, or, what I mean.
Before we jump in there, I do want to just throw in one more quick example when it comes to how white supremacy still actively affects non-white people. Black Lives Matter, right? And this is twofold, because one, there's the debate on whether or not black people are treated correctly by the criminal justice system.
Right.
Spoiler, they're not.
Right.
And you can debate that for whatever. Just go to the internet and figure it out.
Well, I mean, it's like 37% of our population is like black or people of color, but like 60 to 67 or 70% of the prison population is black people or people of color.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a later episode for sure. But what I really wanted to focus on too was the subversion of the narrative.
Right.
Is that when someone says Black Lives Matter, the right goes, well, that's violent,
Right.
But what?
Right.
When did Black Lives Matter? What was the last attack? They like tried to make the Texas shooter kind of like intertwined with it, something like that.
Right, yeah.
But in reality,
or
it's
they
like,
conflate them with like ISIS and shit.
Yeah. Or, my favorite is they just throw in some kind of like really empty rhetoric, like all lives matter.
Right.
Something that like you can't really argue with. It's kind of like support the troops. It's like, well, I don't want to say I don't support the troops. So,
right.
Of course all lives matter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's the same type of...
When in reality, what they're essentially doing is it's yet again, it's an erasure. It's an erasure of a particular struggle from a group of people that have been structurally disadvantaged in society for a very long time.
Yeah.
Which is very much related to white supremacy.
So instead of actually discussing, why is it that people of color are overrepresented in prison populations, now instead we're talking about, is it okay to kneel at a football game.
Right,
You know,
right.
you're completely, and it's not the left that's
Yeah.
setting that agenda. It's the right who's setting that agenda on what are we allowed to talk about? What are the questions we're allowed to ask? You
Right.
know?
The funny thing about that too is like people on the right will say, well, black people just commit more crime, right? They'll just say some bullshit like that. But
Right.
it's like if you really look at it, it's like it's so much deeper.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like the socialization, the like we've been reiterating throughout, like the history of inequality and the structures that perpetuate that. I mean, these are things that we can't analyze in just a short moment. And by saying, it's just, well, these type of people are just more violent or more criminal, but it's not even that. It's not that at all. Like you have to look at these things from a structural point of view. And to say that is not only incorrect to say that about a particular identity, but it is an erasure of sorts to say that's just the way things are for those type of people. I mean, it has no explanatory value in trying to dissect these problems.
Yeah. If they say like, well, black people just commit more crimes, or let me show you the FBI crime statistics or whatever, you really need to ask, well, why do you think that is? And usually it's something like they'll always revert to, well, it's culture. Well, culture, isn't that socially constructed?
Right.
Can't we help
Yeah. What
make
about
a better culture?
What about the
What do you propose to fix that?
Yeah.
It's going to look like something like what a Democrat would propose. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
On the other end, if they don't want to say it's culture, if they're going to stay away from that, then what? Chase them down. And you know what the answer is always going to be? Is it's going to be, well, they're a little bit different. Genetically, they're a little...
Yeah.
Right.
little precarious. They're just a tiny bit not the
Right,
same
so
as white
maybe we
people,
should just be separate but equal.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
or
Yeah,
some
it's
shit
just-
like
I'm not
that.
saying
Some
kick the
bullshit.
black people out. I'm saying let's just make an area where they can't come in.
Right,
like,
right.
It's just a
That's
word
where
game.
it goes down.
It's
I
a
mean,
word game.
didn't Lincoln want to send like the slaves to their own colony or something like that?
I have no idea.
There was some bullshit with
I
that.
will
but
not even pretend to know
Yeah,
anything
we'll
about
fuck
that.
on-
but
tapping out.
the funny thing is like let's look at like Australia, which was like a prison colony, and it's like mostly a like white dominated society.
Right.
And I mean, you still have like high incidence of crime in their society too, because it's a metropolitan capitalist society. So it's like if you want to say that, you've got to really cross-examine with other cultures too.
Mhm.
I mean, every culture has its own sort of development, and especially like American culture and American society. But if you can't find that these correlations exist across those boundaries, then maybe if you're an actual honest like data scientist or a statistics person, like you should be able to admit to yourself that there is no consistency among data.
I think also too is in any, in a white supremacist society or society built on white supremacy, and we're going to get more into policing in later episodes, but it's like you also have to say who is being policed the most heavily. Is it that these communities versus these communities are committing more crime, or that they're disproportionately being targeted for, supposed crimes that when they actually do look at the data, it's like it's pretty even spread amongst like across the board, like white people, black people, Hispanic people, whatever, tend to do the same amount of drugs or, or partake in like drug use or do this crime or that crime. And yet it's only one group of people or a couple groups of people who are being disproportionately targeted by
Yeah.
the police.
I mean, definitely like poorer communities
Yes.
and like racialized communities are absolutely targeted more
Right.
dominantly
And
by
you also
police.
have to ask again, to what role does poverty play in all these sorts of things? But I mean, anyway, to kind of go more to where you were going, Matt, I think, one question that should be proposed to the group is more, how do liberals view identity as it intersects with white supremacy and capitalism versus the left?
Like we kind of touched on, liberals are just more concerned with optics.
Right.
They're more concerned with like we've mentioned before, they're concerned with like civility over
Right.
conciliation. They don't really care about, in a structural sense, they don't really care about fixing the problems. They just want people to be civil about them so that they go away.
Right. But yeah, I think another example too with, how are liberals conceptualizing this? How are they conceptualizing identity as it intersects with white supremacy and capitalism and all that sort of thing compared to the left? I think, you were just saying they're more concerned with optics. I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, you could have, like, I think liberals would be like, they would be the first to share an article that's like, first queer person of color to be in charge of the Chicago PD,
Right.
and they'd be like, oh, yes, queen, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, okay, but they never structurally changed like the white supremacist elements that exist in the Chicago PD, for instance,
or the
something like that.
institution itself. Like, just
Right.
because they're now in charge doesn't mean that they have like institutional power
Right.
over anything.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, when they're talking about identity and white supremacy, I don't even think they like I would say capitalism they completely remove from that equation entirely. Like, they're just exactly, it's more like civility, or they view white supremacy as something that is it's
It's just a bad like evil of people.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
an individual basis. There's no structural examination to be had about it.
Right.
It's just bad people. Like Nazis are jerks and just punch Nazis and blah 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 and like that'll fix it.
There's
But
just
it's
a
like,
few bad apples out there.
Yeah.
Right.
Spoiling the bunch.
they don't have a structural critique, and that's the biggest difference between like a liberal conception of white supremacy and a left-wing conception of white supremacy, because ultimately they don't really think capitalism is a problem or reproducing these
or
these-
related to it.
yeah, they don't. I mean, capitalism is reproducing these inequalities.
Right.
I mean, without a fucking doubt.
Right.
It is reproducing these things, but liberals think that it can be reformed and doesn't automatically exploit people with lesser means or with lesser opportunity in society. I think liberals are mostly just overwhelmed by it.
Mhm.
Like, you could tell like liberals like what we're talking about. Like, a liberal could listen to this and be like, okay, well, I understand what you're saying, but like, where do we go from here?
Right.
It's like, my dad is a business owner, and if we got rid of capitalism,
Right.
then it's like that's where the conversation would go. The main problem is the structural awareness. Like,
Right.
they have no class consciousness. They're not aware of capitalism on a structural level or how it works. They don't question these things
Right.
because they're just not socialized to, and that's where we come in.
Right.
and there's like a whole sect of liberals who are, free speech advocates and stuff like that as
Exactly.
well.
Yeah.
Who will say, well, I don't agree with the Nazi, but I would die for them to keep them
Yeah.
Right.
the right to speak and stuff like that. And it's like absolutely ridiculous.
They'll go like Voltaire,
and some of
say-
them go even a step further and actually undermine organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Center. People like Dave Rubin or Sam Harris, who claim to be liberals, will actually name drop these types of organizations and try to undermine their credibility. Say, oh no, they called me an enabler, so therefore they're absolutely ridiculous. No one should pay attention to them.
Right.
And it's like, in a way, aren't you helping build that narrative
Yeah.
for the people who are trying to rebrand on the right? You're pushing that anti-SJW narrative
Right.
for them.
But that's the thing. It's like, I think that's what's so incompetent about liberal politics, and it's just so impotent about them, because they have no structural awareness. So Sam Harris, who is, in my opinion, mostly a liberal, could say these things and then take his base and just warp them away from understanding something in a structural way, because he's just playing individual like identity politics
Yeah.
with these people
It
or
cre-
these institutions,
it creates a pipeline, is what a lot of people on the internet
Exactly.
call it. Is
Exactly.
it starts with Sam Harris and Dave Rubin, but then it goes to Jordan Peterson,
Right.
and then it goes to, I don't know, let's just click on this Richard Spencer video, see what this guy's about. Oh, he's nice, but I don't believe in him.
Right.
But now you're one step closer.
Yeah,
to-
I mean, I would actually kind of, I mean, like, I get where you guys are going with, like, Sam Harris being a liberal. I mean, when I even think of like more liberals in this respect, I'm thinking more of like the like kind of Alyssa Milano type. You know what I mean? Because like, yeah, Sam Harris, they're liberals and they may like not really like Trump that much, but they also have some pretty reactionary tendencies. Overtly, I think most liberals, when they have reactionary tendencies, they tend to not realize it. But like the Alyssa Milano type, to someone like her, like white supremacy, it's like recently just kind of like fell out of the sky,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there's no understanding structurally as to why it has been resurging, and they certainly don't correlate it with capitalism.
Yeah.
And it's all like their solution to it is, okay, well, we just need to have more diversity in our movies or our commercials.
And people
or,
need to be nice to each other.
But I
and
think,
love
but
each other.
But I
and-
think what happens is when you do those things, for instance, like you have more representation, which more representation is a good thing. I'm just saying it's not a total fix, because what happens is when you have all this like diversification and representation without that structural kind of economic fix along with it, You then have people who are like, let's say, disenfranchised economically or like very working class and say they're white, see more of this diversity. And on top of that, they have economic hardship. And then someone says, well, the reason that you have economic hardship is because of cultural Marxism that puts trans people in movies to turn your children gay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, I don't know, guys. Like, I saw a movie or I saw anime recently about a trans person, and I'm thinking of, just changing over teams.
right.
Exactly.
I mean, that's not a real thing. Like, people learn and grow and learn who they are, and then they make their own decisions about these things. Like,
Right.
someone seeing gay parents on television isn't going to make them want to be gay if they don't have an attraction to the same sex. Like,
Right.
these things are ridiculous tropes that the right comes up with, and they explain nothing. Like, they have no explanatory value. They're simply just anxieties about society changing from the white patriarchal dominant society that they feel comfortable with to something that they don't feel comfortable with.
Yeah. I mean, but anyway, I mean, I think we've talked.
I mean, shit.
I think. Well, I think we've definitely hit. I think the differences between liberals and the left on this issue. But another topic that I think comes up on the left, on the right, in the liberal center-y group, I guess, is this concept of white privilege, and everyone has a hard time defining it, showing specific examples of it. But what the fuck, we're gonna try and do it now. What is white privilege, and how has this privilege become embedded in Western society?
So white privilege is sort of like this idea that stems from many things. Like, it's cultural, there's an economic basis, which we've been really just hammering to death all episode. But white privilege is this idea that white people have this structural advantage in society, which is definitely true,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of hard to pin down. Like, there are examples of it, like we talked about earlier, where, someone with a quote unquote black sounding name is less likely to be called back for an interview.
Right.
And I mean, there are various different things. Like, when we go back to our previous episode, we talked about white flight and how
Mm-hmm.
it was harder for black people around the civil rights era to get mortgages
Right.
compared to like white people. That's the history of like white privilege.
Right.
But how it manifests culturally is kind of something different. It manifests culturally as, what we were talking about before, is how, like, just because the Civil Rights Act happened and now it's illegal to discriminate doesn't mean that private corporations are going to just allow that.
Right.
They're going to skirt around it in any possible
Find
way
other
that
ways.
they can.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the cultural legacy, or that's like the institutional legacy of colonialism and uneven development that now creates a culture of modern society where we have these things like you're less likely to be called back for an interview, you're less likely to have good credit or to be able to be accepted for a mortgage or different things like that. And I mean, there are many other examples. I'm sure you guys have like examples of your own.
Yeah.
But that would be an example of like white privilege and how it's built structurally into society. It's not to say that white people don't struggle. Like, we're all white here, like
Right.
all three of us, like, we're white, but we acknowledge that white privilege has allowed us a place in society that we wouldn't otherwise have if we had different identities.
Or might not. Yeah, and there's like, again, more examples, subtle things like the fact that I can pretty much be walking down any suburban street in America at nighttime and I'm not going to get pulled over by the cops or something. That's an example, but I think one thing I do want to hit on is like on this white privilege topic is I think the left needs to get a lot better at talking about this, because how it's manifested now is basically, in my opinion, a lot of like rad libs on the internet just like yelling at people who I think are very like much like financially not doing very well and saying, oh, but you have white privilege and like basically all of society caters to you. And I think that narrative needs to change, because if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of like political knowledge and you struggle financially, this is probably like, that's where you see those people online, typically right-wing people, are like, oh, when do I get to activate my white privilege,
my white privilege card
or something, but like I think this is an issue that needs to be spoken about better on the left. But yeah, so another thing is I think that like, white privilege, being that it is also discussed fairly heavily with like liberal groups, when liberals discuss white privilege, a lot of times the issues I have is they talk about what it is, And I think that a lot of times the kind of definition they give or what an example they use is fairly accurate, but it's almost like they clout shame on the internet. Like,
Yeah.
so, and it's a lot of, I think, white guilt, and they just want woke Twitter to like notice them. But they'll be like, oh, this is a perfect example of white privilege. But if you were to ever say, okay, so what then is the solution to this notion of white privilege permeating in society? It's just, again, it always defaults back to, well, we just need more representation, and white people need to stop speaking on certain issues, which I fundamentally disagree with. I think the current state of the Democratic candidates running right now is a perfect testament to that, because the only legitimate progressive candidate that's running is Bernie Sanders. I mean, yeah, he's a white dude, but if you're going to try and pull the card that Kamala Harris is the one who needs to be talking about racial justice issues in the United
I mean,
States,
she's a cop
when
and a
when she's
prosecutor. Like,
literally contributed far more to the problem than the dude who was arrested at a civil rights protest in the fucking 60s.
and then also Kamala is like in support of prison labor.
Yes, exactly. The identity politics part, that's where there's so much more nuance than just you're white and therefore this, and
Yeah.
there needs to be a broader discussion that is structurally grounded.
Right. I mean, to define it for the listener so that it's very clear, racism as a concept is more this individual and group level process and structure that is like implicated in the reproduction of racial inequality. But systemic racism happens when these structures or institutions or processes are carried out by groups with power, like governments or businesses, schools, like we talk about in our uneven development episodes. But racism differs from this concept of bias, which is a conscious or unconscious prejudice against an individual or group based on just their identity. So, it could be their ethnicity, it could be their sexual orientation, whatever. That's the difference between, racism, systemic racism, and then bias. But when we talk about white privilege, we're not talking about privilege on a individual or like a privilege from bias basis, because people can still be biased against white people, right? But white people in the West and in the US don't experience systemic racism because our society was built with white dominance in mind. And that's like what we're trying to get people to understand about white supremacy. It was built on this idea that we're importing slaves for a lot of American history, and it took until the Civil War era to even have an armed dispute about it, until, it took 100 years more almost for us to grant voting rights and equal citizenship to black people. So it's like these are things that don't just go away by making them illegal. And that's what you have to understand about like white privilege and systemic racism versus just what racism means as a concept versus, again, just bias. Here's something for the right wingers out there. Like, just because someone called you a cracker doesn't mean that you've been systemically disadvantaged in society. You may have experienced some type of a bias towards you because of your identity, but you're not experiencing racism. You're not experiencing racism or systemic racism or prejudice in a economic or a structural or institutional sense. And that's why you have white privilege.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, so I 100%, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. I don't have anything to add. So with that, going to our final point, kind of switching gears a little bit, but still on the same theme, how does the dilemma of free speech create a hospitable environment for white supremacists?
Great. So this is an immense topic, and we could write a whole episode on this and just spend the whole episode giving examples. But a couple that come to mind in recent news would be like, and it happens all the time too, like the Christchurch murderer in New Zealand, who got into the mosque and basically shot up all the Muslims who were, mid Friday prayer. And it happened back in March. And another crazy thing is like the dude live streamed like the first part of it on Facebook. But here's the thing, when we start to talk about this intersection of free speech, like a lot of these types, like on the conservative side, Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer, and to a lesser extent, maybe some of the pundits like Jordan Peterson or Shapiro, these people are crying out against like being censored by the big media conglomerates like Facebook or Twitter. But these people are putting literal murders on Facebook and live streaming them to people, right? I mean, they're putting it out there and making it so accessible to other people that they're almost manufacturing consent for it to be allowed, right? So when we talk about this free speech concept, I mean, it's something that liberals and the right love to harp on and say that socialists or Marxists or communists are like anti-free speech and they're authoritarian. But when it really comes down to it, like, do you want Facebook to be hosting a video of a literal fucking right-wing terrorist live streaming murdering Muslims on your computer at home? Like, do you want that? Like, do you think that that type of speech or that type of expression should be protected? And that's the question that I ask myself. What I really get down to is like these type of institutions that are not hard, they don't take a hard line stance on repressing this type of information. They create a hospitable environment for terrorism, for right-wing punditry to manufacture consent to not only their ideas, but the ideas that, based on this Christchurch shooter in particular, he was naming Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, even Trump as like an inspiration for committing this heinous act. And it's like, of course, they want to all divest from it, you know, and they want to repress like this guy's free speech when it doesn't agree to their agenda. But free speech in general is kind of like an interesting concept because, of course, we all want to be able to say what we have to say without someone repressing it. But in a sense, like what speech is good for society, what speech is bad for society, what speech should be limited because it attacks certain groups for their unalienable characteristics of their identity, and what speech should not be allowed in general. Like, should we allow a fucking mass murderer to live stream these things on Facebook?
My thing is, I'm a big proponent of active and engaged participatory democracy and the right to, debate and say what you feel and how you feel and argue your points and not be, thrown in fucking jail for it or killed or whatever. That said, I do not believe any democratic society should allow a space for organized white supremacy in the form of these various hate organizations and groups to be allowed to exist.
Right.
Period. Okay. Now, do I believe that under the current conditions of capitalism, if some sort of legislation or enactment to do this type of thing would actually have the intended consequences that I envision? Absolutely, of course not. Because what they would do is, again, with the whole horseshoe theory thing, is conflate the far right with the far left and say that they're actually the same and they both advocate the same, horrendous things. And also, by the way, any criticism of class is
Off, out of bounds.
Yeah, out of bounds. It's offensive. We're people of means. We're not billionaires. That kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
Again, I'm a massive proponent of what I guess you would consider free speech, but not to an extent where spaces of hate, spaces of extreme organized violent white supremacy and that sort of thing are allowed to exist and function in society.
Yeah. And I want to just make a distinction because, of course, I'm like a proponent of free speech as well, but I just think there's a difference between calling for things against the ruling class, because the ruling class isn't an identity, it's a social category of people who own the means of production. It's not a specific unalienable characteristic of someone's identity to be rich. Whereas like someone who is non-white, that is not something that they chose, and it's an unalienable characteristic of their identity to be black or to be Latino, to be whatever. But the thing is like these people on the far right, these neo-Nazis and white supremacists target these people and the minorities or LGBTQ people because of unalienable characteristics of their identity. And that is something that I think is hate.
Right.
Like that is undoubtedly hate. And it shouldn't be allowed. Like, I want to repress that. I don't want spaces for hate and for white supremacists to peddle their bullshit and to market to each other. and to honestly get rich off this stuff.
Yeah.
Like there are people out there that get rich off misinformation and disinformation, like Alex Jones, even Ben Shapiro to an extent. Like these are people that make money off of disseminating these false ideas to people. And I don't want any space for hate. Like in my ideal world, like, I mean, if a literal mass murderer is telling you that he got his inspiration from Candace Owens, from Ben Shapiro, from right-wing pundits, like these people should be repressed. Like, I mean, if this has any responsibility in creating these terrorists, it should be repressed. And I mean, we don't want a space for this type of stuff at all. And maybe that comes across as authoritarian to some people, but I'd rather live in a society where we don't allow hate in that sense. But I do want to make that distinction because I think it's very important. People will sort of apologize for revolution, and I'm not going to do that. Like the rich and the people of wealth, or whatever you want to call it, people of means, like that's not an unalienable characteristic of their identity. Like you could take away their wealth and they would still be who they are, on the inside or whatever. But that's why I think it's different to take away the free speech to allow people to criticize the rich versus taking away the right of someone to basically say, I don't want minorities to exist.
Right.
And to be really incisive about it, when we get right down to it, like when you argue that fascists should be defeated through like debate or this marketplace of ideas, what you're really suggesting is that like vulnerable minorities should have to endlessly argue for their fucking right to exist. And then at no point should that debate ever be over. Like we're always going to allow fascists and white supremacists to say that minorities don't have a right to exist because it's their free speech. And I just simply won't put up with that. And if you want to call me an authoritarian, so be it.
A lot of people will say, kind of like Matt alluded to here, duke it out in the marketplace of ideas, right? Why not just have a little bit of intellectual curiosity and see what happens when you talk to people like Richard Spencer and whatnot? But the problem is every time you platform somebody, you're inevitably exposing your audience to those ideas.
Exactly.
Right.
And even though the vast majority of people might not buy into it, there's always going to be that sliver of people who do. And if it's not today, it's because they followed the recommended YouTube video and they ended up on the Christchurch Manifesto or something like that.
Anthony Fantino video.
And it started making more and more sense as it got pounded in their head,
Right, and
by the algorithm.
Right, and it's not like not allowing for the organization of these, groups and these sorts of, very hateful, monstrous ideas to exist. It's not like stopping that from happening is going to stop certain people from having those views. We're simply aiming to take the power and authority or
away.
Potential power and authority completely away, because any society that what I would consider allows for free speech means that you are allowed to be critical of structural power forces in your society, meaning your government, in the US's case, like giant corporations, capitalist powers that be, but whatever it may be. However, in allowing these people to be sort of in that same category, it allows for them to gain access to power that they might not otherwise have, and in turn, again, exterminate groups of people, minorities, for instance, in society.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a free speech absolutist. People say
Right.
that term, but here's the thing. No one would agree that threats are okay. No one would agree that yelling fire in a crowded building is okay.
Right.
So we can all decide, hey, there's some things that actually present an imminent danger to people, and they
Right.
shouldn't be said out loud.
Right.
Right? Well, when does hate speech get to that level?
Right.
You know what I mean? You need to sit down and figure out, well, where's actually hate speech having a real effect, like yelling fire in a crowded building does, or actually sending people threats,
Right.
Something to think about.
Yeah, at some point you just have to take a stand as a leftist. Like you have to take a stand against that stuff and say, I'm willing to repress these ideas because I find them objectively negative in society. And I think that's where leftists should be. I think you should have the courage to be able to divest yourself from this absolutely bullshit continuing debate about free speech and just realize that, like, while it does have value, you shouldn't allow institutional power to things that are objectively negative in society. And we'll just come right out and say it, like capitalism and white supremacy are what the US is based on, what we've always been based on. We've never been anything but that society. And, while we are trying to deal with those things and have tried to deal with those things through, struggle. I mean, we will always have that history. And so those are things that I think the left should be unambiguously and courageously against. Like, you should not want to give institutional power to fascism or to white supremacy or to capitalism. And, you shouldn't be afraid to say that or to take that stand.
Yeah, we are not here to debate and in turn platform fascism or fascist ideology. On the left, the position should be, quite frankly, to smash it.
And smash that like button and subscribe to the entrylevelleft.com.
Yeah. And so with that, guys, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Entry Level Left. Again, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple, we're on Google, we're on YouTube, we're on Stitcher, we're on CastBox, even on Pocket Cast. You can get our episodes, you can stream our episodes, download them from our website, which is www.entrylevelleft.com. Everything is for free there. You can grab it, take a listen. Let us know what you think in the comments on our Facebook. You can find us on Twitter as well, at the Entry Level Left or at Entry Level Left. And if you follow us on Apple or Google, it really helps if you leave us a comment or some type of a review. That way other people can find our podcast and let us know what they think as well. So again, thanks for tuning in. We hope you join us for our next episode.